Three, two, one. Welcome back to the Frequency of Fatherhood Summit. Today I have on Duey Freeman. Duey Freeman is a therapist. This man's been in the work for over 50 years. I was just telling him the idea and concept of the Frequency of Fatherhood Summit has come from the work that he does. I've come in contact with Duey on multiple occasions through workshops where he's taught about attachment theory, what contact is, a powerful relationship, all about how the relational dynamic as men is changing. And so all of the speakers that you see have some sort of vision for me, how Duey represents in the work that he does. I'm a disciple of Dewey's work and I really love it. So first of all, Duey, thank you so much for coming and taking
Sure.
time out of your day.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Absolutely. Dewey, I want you to dive in before we get into the juicy part. What drove you into this work, really made you want to do what you do?
You mean therapy in the first place?
Therapy and men's work, working with men.
Well, super quick, I actually started off as a mechanical engineer and physicist, and I was on the Kent State campus in May 4th, 1970, when the shootings took place, where the National Guard shot and killed 4 students, plus wounded 8 or I think it was 9. And that blew me away. So I ended up not being an engineer and started working with kids down in Southwest Ohio and in an outward bound program. And that shift has driven me to become a teacher, at one point a principal of a school, and then ultimately a therapist and college professor. That's the super quick and dirty. As far as working with men, I've actually had an interest in working with men literally since I was 20 years old. And in the last 4 to 5 years, I have intensified that through working with a couple of different men's groups and the leaders of those men's groups, which are amazing, amazing men.
Yeah.
So actually, Alex and I met through It's a Man Uncivilized initiation. So plug for Alex and plug for Man Uncivilized.
I really appreciate that because the work that you do, it really brings it back to that connection to self, especially within men. And before we dive into fatherhood, I want to go into something that you speak of often, especially within Man Uncivilized and the work that I've seen you do. You always use this word, the term contact. And for those that are not familiar with the work you do, can you describe what contact means?
Sure. Actually, yes, I do always use that word. In fact, when I teach classes, I tell most of my students, I teach classes to therapists, is if you don't know the answer to something, just about 80 to 90% of the time, just say contact and that'll be the right answer. So this is my definition of contact. Contact is the place with attuned presence where our spiritual, emotional, physical, and energetic boundaries touch another. And it's really the cornerstone of virtually every relationship. And actually, let me expand on that a little bit. By what I mean by that is contact. Contact is it's a cornerstone of attachment. It's a cornerstone of friendship. And there's a progression that I see that if we're in contact with another person and that contact is consistent and predictable over time, that creates a connection between us and another being. If we're in connection and that's predictable and consistent over time, that's actually what creates relationship. And if we're in relationship, that's predictable and consistent over time, that's what creates intimacy between two beings. And that intimacy, sometimes that includes sexual intimacy, but that's not necessarily the intimacy that I'm talking about. It's the intimacy between us and another being, which actually in my world can include animals such as my horses, and also nature, is that we can literally have intimate relationships with the trees, the land, the plants, the animals around us.
Every time I hear that, it just sends chills down my spine, and it makes me think about like the importance of men understanding that basic concept. And I know it's easier said than done, but being able to bring that reflection and that presence and the thought behind that is so powerful in relationship to other people. And so I asked you, as we dive into fatherhood with the context of contact, dive into what the role of fathers actually is.
Well, can I talk a little bit more broadly and then sort of bring that back?
Absolutely.
First of all, I'm not sure that in our society that we know what the role of father is. That most of it, in a socialized perspective, is providing for family, protection, working, coming up with finances, paying the bills, repairing things around the house, all of those kinds of things. I'm in the middle of putting together a class on how to work with men. And a statistic that I ran across, and this is actually from a very reliable source, is that men in general, I know there are men who don't fit this particular category, but men in general only have on average 11 minutes a day with their children in contact. It doesn't mean that they're not in the house, but what I'm talking about is truly being in contact with their children. So if a man's coming home and they're scrolling or they're reading the newspaper or they're watching sports on TV, those kinds of things, that's not true intimate contact. Sometimes it can be a nice thing to do. I'm not negating anything with that. However, that true contact where between a father and a son or a father and a daughter, there's eye contact, there's healthy physical contact, there's play, there's wrestling, there's helping with homework, there's making food, there's helping with chores, all of those kinds of things. On average, the American father spends about 11 minutes a day with their kids, which to me is scary. It like blows me away. So if we're really working with fatherhood, the biggest thing that children need is an incredible amount of time, an incredible amount of contact with their kids. It doesn't, and typically what happens with that is there is fathers either end up in a role as a disciplinarian or they end up in the role of a playmate. And part of what we need to bring in and hold with that is a concept that I talk about, structure with softness or softness with structure. Either way, you can put that, where the structure is actually helping with child rearing and discipline and boundaries, etc., as well as the softness is like that play and sitting your kids on your lap and chatting and helping problem solve and all of those kinds of things. So we need both of those things as a role as a parent and clearly as a role as a father. I did that help answer what you were asking?
It did. It scratched the surface, and it gives me an opportunity. Something came up as you were saying all that is I've heard you and Michael say many times that as men, we emulate the most masculine relationship we experience or witness growing up. And that's our fathers or their fathers. And I say all this because if we see how we're evolving relationally, men, we are starting to be at the front line of being more present. And I think a lot of men don't know how to handle that. Can you dive into the shifting aspect into fatherhood?
Yeah. So let me again broaden that. We oftentimes emulate the um our fathers around men learning how to be fathers and learning how to be men. But the biggest thing that we emulate is how our fathers treat our mothers and how our fathers treat our siblings and how our fathers treat other people. It's not just how they treat us. The way that we learn to be with a woman or with other people is through watching our parents interact. When, for instance, fathers don't interact, then what the message is that we as men don't have to interact, which is an interesting way to have a relationship by not interacting. It doesn't work out so well. So that place that you're talking about around how do we emulate our fathers and how do we emulate masculinity really has to do with how do our fathers interact with our mothers, with their fathers, and with our siblings. And I mean, that's within our family. And uh, oftentimes what happens is that we don't get to see them interact. So often, so, or many times that interaction is negative instead of positive and kind and supportive. So we end up growing up thinking that that's what men are supposed to be doing. If we watch our parents where our fathers are, and this comes back to the structure with softness piece, is sometimes we have fathers that are incredibly structured, so there's not real contact there because there's a rigidity, or there'll be softness. They'll have the softness and the kindness, but they don't have a backbone. So many times and it's not quite that binary, but oftentimes that's really what's happening is that there's a huge amount of a large number of men who sort of do one or the other instead of being able to be fluid between structure with softness. And we need to be able to have both, and we need to be able to flow between those two places. Um, and the structure has to do with creating boundaries and at times discipline, and the softness has to do with creating support, compassion, empathy, and understanding, those kinds of things.
You mentioned structure with softness. We've talked about contact. Can you dive into with I want to stay on this your theory and what you've developed and the work you do. Can you dive into maybe brief or however, I know we could be here for hours on this topic, but the attachment theory and how that plays in relationship to men and to fathers?
Sure, to the best I can. And so what I'll preface this with is when I teach this, I take a whole semester in a master's program to teach attachment. So we probably won't get through all of it. First of all, the primary attachment that I'm talking about is the attachment bond that happens from the time of conception through about 2.5 to 3 years of life. That's our first attachment bond. And most of the time people talk about that being with mothers, which it is. And what's interesting is that even in utero, when we as fathers speak to our wives, partners, the mother of our children, even when our babies are in utero, they hear us, they get us energetically. And there's been study after study that when a child is born, if a father's been present and a father's been talking to literally their baby inside their mother's womb, is that the baby actually recognizes them. They recognize their voice. They actually even recognize their smell, which is mind-blowing to me. It's just mind-blowing to me. And then throughout the early parts of life, the first year to year and a half, the interaction between mom and dad and the baby is unbelievably important. So let me talk about that a little bit. What creates attachment with all of us? Well, let me back up. First of all, there's hundreds of different perspectives on attachment out there. Some of the ones that people hear about are John Bowlby with the secure attachment and the different kinds of insecure attachment. I think Bowlby was brilliant in what he did. And I think that just labeling ourselves as secure or unsecure in various ways is it's not quite enough. But let me make this really simple for people. The way that we attach, and when we really attach and attach well, what that means is that we're creating trusting and predictably trustful relationships with another being. And that's what really happens. Our early attachment with our mothers and our fathers create the blueprint for how we do relationship the rest of our lives. And that blueprint is created through the process of going through a tough time in contact, in relationship with another being, and coming out okay. In infancy, babies go through that somewhere between 10 and 15 times an hour. I did a study on that in the early 90s. And sometimes that going through a hard time, all that is a baby crying, maybe laying and crying and going, and a parent will reach over and maybe touch their tummy and slightly rock them, and they will go, and then they settle. And that's the whole attachment cycle. So I want to emphasize that piece. The same thing happens in adult relationships, is when we can go through a tough time in adult relationships and come out okay. But how we do that as adults is based on the blueprint that we had in infancy. We can, if things go wrong in that early blueprint, we can heal that, but that's really where that comes from. I'll give you an example, and I hope I'm not putting you on the spot here too much, Alex, but when we were in Texas and we had horses at the ranch, you went out and played with those horses for hours. And part of that was you trying to ask the horse to do certain things. And at first it was like, this isn't happening. How do I do this? How do I do what you did, Dewey? That kind of thing. And it's like, but you stayed with it and you kept going through a hard time with those horses and coming out okay. And then you try again, even if it didn't fully work. And then you try again, even if it didn't fully work. Until you got to the point where the horses are going, yeah, okay, this dude's good. Does that make sense?
It does.
So we can do that as adults, but that's based on what happens early on. Let me add one more piece in here. So what's interesting is our birthing process is our first really hard time that we go through, and we work on coming out okay. So our birthing process is incredibly important. So And it's actually a really big deal on if we come out okay, or if we come out. And what I mean is we go through a birthing process and we get laid on our mother's chest. We get snuggled, dad's there, supporting mom, dad holds baby, all of those kinds of things. That's really different than if a baby comes out and has been born breech or, um, and I'll just share part of the reason I know so much about attachment is that when I was born, my mother had tuberculosis. So, and that was 1950. So in 1950, tuberculosis was basically a death sentence. And so I was born, my mother was whisked away. She was put in a sanitarium for nearly 18 months. I was born and taken away from her. And when we were reunited at 18 months, she literally said I was like a neighbor kid moving back in. So that changes everything so what happened to me is I went through a hard time and didn't come out okay. And that's been a piece that I've had to work with, and a piece that has actually driven me to put together what I put together. The other pieces that really come into this is there are three things that we need in infancy that we always get in utero. One of them is food, one of them is touch, and one of them is movement. When infants need those three things, I call it bidding, they bid for them by crying, by wiggling, by being cute, by slobbering, by peeing all over the place, by all of those things. When we see that and we meet those needs in contact and relationship, and that's that presence that I was talking about, contact, and help our babies come through that okay, they actually creates trust. And when that becomes predictable, that's really what creates healthy attachment. Interesting piece with that, especially since we're talking about fatherhood, is that mothers do that, and mothers do that by, particularly in healthy places when they can, by breastfeeding and holding and rocking. But many times what happens with fathers is fathers go, well, I can't breastfeed, so I'm not going to do that. But the reality is that there's hundreds of opportunities to do that with infants that isn't about breastfeeding, like touch and movement and picking babies up and rocking them and holding them, and even supplementing feeding in different ways than breastfeeding is incredibly powerful, and it's a piece that we as fathers need to be able to do. That's a lot, and it's sort of quick and dirty, but if people can remember that going through a tough time in contact, in relationship, develops trust, and that process being predictable and consistent is what creates attachment, then if that's all you remember, you'll have 99% more understanding of attachment than most people have in the world.
Yeah. I remember you said this in the initiation, and it's something that I use with my own relationship with my wife. When I'm going through some internal tough time, that contact of saying, "Hey, we're okay. I got to figure something out here." Can you
Mhm.
can you just dive into maybe some practical application of what you just said so men are tangible and they're like, "Dewey, tell me how to do this."
You mean with their wives or with their kids or in general?
Wives, kids, in general. All three there. You can answer however you want.
Got it. Well, here's what I see happen with men. What I see happen with men is oftentimes when men get upset or feel hurt or feel displaced, they leave, they isolate. And the biggest thing that men need to be able to do is to be able to stay in contact. So let's talk about relationship with wife or partner or lover, whichever. I don't know any relationship where it's always, you know, roses and rainbows. I don't know of any relationship that does that. And in fact, a relationship that's always roses and rainbows is probably not a very healthy one, because you don't know that you can go through a tough time with that person and come out okay. Um, so and actually, let me give an example. I just literally got some blood tests back yesterday that had a couple weird things in it, and not big and horrible, but it was like, oh, that doesn't make any sense. And my partner Kimberly said, we're on, all she did when I was talking to her, all she did was say, hey babe, we're on the same team. We'll get through whatever we need to get through. And again, I want to emphasize there's nothing life threatening, nothing like that. But it was like, I'm going, what, something's weird here. But it's that ability to not isolate, and the ability to not invade. And so men tend to do one of those two things. We tend to isolate and go, fuck you, I'm out of here. You know, the door slams behind them, or they go turn the TV on, or they go golf, or they go work out, or they go watch porn, or whatever those things may be. Or they go to work, and I just want to say, as many times, like, work feels like a safe escape and we get praised for that. Man, that dude works so hard. But the other part of it is that we also can move into a place of invading. And what I mean by that is by being too loud, by getting angry, which breaks attachment, by gaslighting, by those kinds of things. The thing that changes all of that is a man being able to stay grounded, mostly through breath, and then becoming curious about what really is happening here. And not what really is happening here from, you know, I'm going to go into my therapy mode or my coaching mode, but more like, what really is happening? Did I make a mistake? Did I misunderstand? Did the person I'm talking to make a mistake? Did they misunderstand? So it's literally that place of being able to stay and not either not run away either by leaving or by overwhelming. Does that help a little bit?
It does. I love it. And you know, I'm gonna jump back for a second because I've known this, but it just came to me as we were talking. When my fifth child was born, is it goes to a previous, the power of like holding your child, shirt off, contact, physical contact. You know, the other three to, well, my oldest jumped in. We did a free birth at home, and so my wife had the baby at home, and
Wow.
all the kids got to see it. And after mom got her time with the baby, I was settling the other three, and my oldest son actually comes up and holds the baby, and
That's amazing.
with no shirt on, and for like an hour or two, and he was just like, Dad, let me hold him, and I'm like, okay, I'll give you your time, and taking care of the other kids. And to this day, he's 5 months old. We're not talking years, but 5 months old, and my son has a better time soothing with my oldest son. And so
Isn't
like
that crazy?
just that, what you just said, the power of that, like think about that. For me, you know, like he still soothes with me, but my son can pick him up and he's like mush, right? Where it takes me a
Mhm.
little bit to maneuver and you know, ground myself. And I wanted to just validate what you said with you know, with my own experience and seeing that, and then dive into something that you say all the time is like, our goal is to be congruent in every aspect or every situation we find ourselves in. That's like, can you dive into that concept a little bit?
Yeah, um so let me ask you, just to make sure we're on the same page, from your perspective, what sort of, maybe we can talk about this together. What's congruency mean? When you say that, what's that mean? Just so
I
that,
Yeah, so I think as fathers, you know, and this is something I'm striving for. So like, I'm not always perfect, but like congruency in all the aspects of how we show up in life. Right. And so
yeah,
like I will be stimulated by something, and there may be some inner turmoil, but how I present myself, obviously I'm feeling those feelings, I'm acknowledging them, I'm allowing them a place, but the way that I show up is congruent in parenting, congruent in my relationship, like just the way that I show up.
Got it. So let me give an example that'll really help people, hopefully. As you know, and as hopefully most people know, or if they don't know, they'll know now. A huge part of my life is working with horses. A huge part. Whether it's my own horses where I'm training and riding and heading up in the mountain with me and my horse and spending a day there, or whether it's working therapeutically with people and my horses. Horses are prey animals, and horses are always looking for congruency. And here's what I mean by that. If a horse is in the wild and they're being stalked, say, by a mountain lion, what that mountain lion is going to do is be very quiet, be very calm, but because of that and what the horse feels energetically, that actually scares a horse. Because there's two things going on with that mountain lion. One, they're calm and quiet, and two, they want to kill me from the horse's perspective. And that's not congruent. So when people come up to my place and are working with horses, I say, well, what do you know about horses? And I go, well, you have to be really quiet. You have to be really calm, and you can't scare them. And I go, not really. In fact, my horses are at a place I can throw a tin garbage can, like underneath them, and they'll just stand there and look at you and go, you doing that again? But here's what I'm talking about. If somebody is scared of horses, maybe they've had not a great experience at some point, but they try to be quiet and calm, that's going to scare a horse. Because a horse is going to pick up that energetically. So if somebody is scared and they go up and they literally, I have people walk up and look at my horses and go, I am so afraid of you that you're going to kill me. Because that's many times what people feel. Essentially, when that's the congruency. I'm scared and I'm not going to pretend like I'm not. I'm scared and I'm going to be scared. And I'm going to tell you that. As soon as that happens, what do you think happens with the horses? They relax, they soften, and they usually walk up and say hi. If somebody walks up and they're scared, but they're pretending like they're not scared, what happens is the horses pick up on that and they oftentimes will walk away. And they go, why is the horse walking away from me? And the reason isn't because the person's scared. The reason is because they're incongruent. And incongruency leads to not being safe. Does that make sense?
It does. It
And the
does.
horses will pick up on that. It's actually called their neuroceptive system, which we have the same system. It's the same part of our system. We have a part of our polyvagal system that's called neuroceptive system. If somebody is angry and they walk up to the horses and they go, I am so fucking pissed, I can't stand it, I just want to break somebody's head open, the horses go, okay, and they're good. I've had people sit on a horse and be incredibly angry and yell and scream and fight, not against a horse, but and the horses are like calm as can be. They could not be more calm. But if somebody's angry and they pretend like they're not, horses pick up on that. And that's the congruency that I'm talking about. And that's a congruency that if in relationship, we say to our partners, I am so upset, I don't know what to do right now. Our partners can go, got it, I can be here. If we pretend like we're not angry, if we pretend like we're not sad, if we pretend like we're not hurt, then that creates problems. Um, because other people that are close to us pick up on all of that stuff energetically, just like horses do.
What I really love about your work and experiencing it myself, you are an energetic masters, like a master. I remember in Texas when we first did this exercise, you were like shooting energy down my leg, and it was so crazy. So I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I can even think about my own life where moments where I've been incongruent and my wife gets more frustrated. And so like that's
Totally.
I'm glad you explained the practical application to like the relational space for us men. And I want to dive in because I know we're running close on time here. I want you to dive in on this last question of what's the difference in raising boys and girls as fathers?
Actually, interestingly enough, there's not much. However, what we do is different, but what our babies need is not different. And so let me talk about that. Typically, what we do is give girls more attention, more affection, more touch, more holding, et cetera, et cetera. What we do is at some point, and it's usually around 2-ish, we stop giving that touch, that holding, that softness, that kindness to boys. And that continues with girls up through about 5, and it ends and starts diminishing at about 2 or 2.5 for boys. And if anyone wants to go read a book that is a little bit mind-blowing, it's called I think it's by a guy named Terrence Real, and I don't want to talk about that as the name of the book, and he has done a bunch of studies on this. But boys are actually born typically more sensitive than girls are. And we stop that sensitivity by stopping the contact that they need, that food, touch, and movement stuff. And we typically stop that between 1 year to 3 years earlier in boys than we do with girls. Like if there's a 5-year-old girl that falls down and gets hurt, many times they get picked up and held and rocked still. A little 5-year-old boy falls down, and it's like, let's fix up your knee and get going, get going again. So the biggest thing is that we need to do differently than we're doing is to continue that food, touch, and movement and that empathy with boys. And both boys and girls will naturally move to a place where they don't want it or need it as much. So that's one piece. The other piece that actually is different is that by the time boys get to be about 5-ish, there are some things, especially around an intellectual thought process, where boys are about developmentally, they're about 1 year behind girls. Now, it doesn't mean that they're always going to stay there. It just means that that's where they're at then. Like when we all grow into adults, we're all developmentally equitable, is the way I would say it. But what happens is that boys go into school, and like in kindergarten, and girls are about close to 1 year ahead developmentally, especially around some cognitive stuff. One of the biggest things that we can do is, if we get a chance, is there's a guy named Richard Reeves who's done a bunch of studying on this, that his proposal is that we redshirt boys and we start them 1 year later in school. And most places you can do that legally. So instead of starting a boy at 5 in kindergarten, start him at 6 in kindergarten. Because later on in adolescence, boys are again about 1.5 years to 2 years behind girls developmentally. and some social and cognitive stuff. Again, it doesn't mean they don't catch up. It's sort of like, it's like this, and then it's like this, and then we end up equitable. So there's a huge amount of evidence that redshirting a boy, and it happens sometimes naturally. Like and I'll tell you how I mean this. My birthday was in July, so I actually started school when I was 5, but I was just barely 5. I have 2 brothers whose birthdays were in September, so they started school a year later because of where their birthdays fell. And they had a much easier time in the social stuff in school than I did. I had some other attachment stuff going on too, but I graduated. I was 17 years old when I graduated from high school because of that. So the 2 big pieces I would say to really help with attachment and connection is allow yourself as fathers to continue to nurture your babies, both boys and girls, as much as they need, and don't get to the place where you go, oh well, he's all boy and blah blah blah. Like let them be all boy or all girl at the same time when they need it. Give them what they need around the nurturing and the sensitivity and the love and the cuddling and all of those things, and then think about some of the cognitive development, and if you can, redshirt your kid. That will give them a much better chance in school, a much better chance of graduating, and frankly, a much better chance of going to college or wherever they may end up wanting to go. If you can pull that one off, give that a shot.
You just shine the light on, I think, what culturally, what we're doing with young boys. It's amazing that just that concept that you just said opened my eyes. Like I've heard you say that before, but like just being able to sit there and really resonate with that's powerful. For those that are watching, or did you want to say something else, Dewey?
Well, let me just say one other piece, and this is really ties into that. I think that culturally, and this has been one of the pieces with the women's movement that I think has been really powerful, is that women's voices culturally have been cut off. And the women's movement and feminism has really fought for women to have their voice, which they deserve. That's a very highly appropriate process. What has gotten missed is that boys' voices haven't been cut off, but their hearts have been cut off. So culturally and socially, we cut girls' voices off and we cut boys' hearts off. And so what I want to promote is helping girls have their voice and helping boys have their hearts. And when we do that, a lot of the bullshit that happens in society is going to shift.
That for anybody, I'm speechless on that because I've never heard you say that before, and that makes so much sense when you really sit. It's logical to me. Anybody that really resonates with everything that you say, how can they get in contact with you? How can they work with you? What programs, offerings do you have?
Well, I do a lot through 3 areas. One is my own. If you go to deweyfreeman.org, it's my website, and a bunch of my stuff is on there. I also run the Gestalt Equine Institute of the Rockies. There's a separate website for that. If you just put in Gestalt Equine Institute, you'll get that. I also work with 2 different men's group, Man and Civilized, and I'm a huge part of what they do. I also work with Connor Beaton. Well, actually, Traver Boehm runs Man Uncivilized. Connor Beaton runs Man Talks, and I work with both of those groups. So those are 4 ways to get a hold of me. Both of those men's groups are fantastic. And I also think that what we're doing, Kimberly and me together, we run the Gestalt Equine Institute. We're also putting together a class called The Art of Instinct and Intuition in Therapy and Coaching. And Kimberly and I teach that together. We also do couples intensives, and we do that together. Kimberly is also a therapist. She's my partner, life partner, as well as business partner. And we work with couples together so that if a couple comes in, I know that there are many different structures of couples. So I'm talking about heterosexual couples. In this case, we also work with people who same-sex couples. So we're not cutting that out, but right now that's what I'm talking about. But we do that. So if a man and a woman come in as a couple, they're working with a man and a woman. And that seems to be really helpful to people.
I really appreciate that, because for men that are listening, men that are going to consume this, Dewey will change your life relationally, not just with yourself, with your kids, and with your partner. I can tell you that my relationship, just from the time that I've met him, has transcended where I thought it could be to this point in my life. So Dewey, thank you again for the knowledge that you dropped, the time that you're taking, and just really helping men be better men and fathers.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here, and I love what you're doing.
I appreciate you doing.
You take care.